Thank you so much for having me. First, I want to apologize. I'm coming out of a flu, so my voice may not be as pleasant as it could be. My aim today is to basically just try to explain and describe what we are doing here. And there's a lot of things that are happening. I try to my best to be concise enough. Feel free to stop me, push me, telling me some areas are boring and you want me to move faster, or explain more. And of course, I will leave some time at the end to have a conversation and get questions and your comments and suggestions. So I'm going to share my slides. Actually, share sound. Okay. So you guys see my slides, right? Okay. So I am director of Stress, Trauma, and Anxiety Research Clinic. And when I came here about to Wayne State University out of my residency about 8 years ago, my goal was to create a system of research that is informed by clinical work and informs clinical work. Because I saw all the time how there is a group of researchers in this corner and there are clinicians on the other corner, and they don't talk much with each other. So the goal was to basically do research that informs clinical work and is also relevant to clinic. So on the clinical side, we basically address trauma in a diverse group of populations, mostly civilian, from survivors of torture and human trafficking to first responders. And on the research side, we are trying our best to understand the neurobiology and environmental factors of risk and resilience and what basically affects the course of illness or course of symptoms after someone is impacted by trauma. We also have a direction in basically developing, improving, advancing treatment methods for anxiety and trauma-related disorders. And I've also found it very fruitful and fulfilling to be involved in public scholarly work and educating the public basically on areas of mental health which are relevant to public interest. And most often there's a lot of misinformation there. So we have been able to talk to the public through all these different media outlets. And as it was mentioned, as Arya mentioned, I outlined of this book, which is basically came out a couple of months ago. It's a over encyclopedia of fear and anxiety for educated public, from evolution to brain, body, why we love to be scared, how we learn to be scared or not to be scared, politics, media, diseases, how we treat these conditions. So, and these are my disclosures in terms of the fundings that we have had in the past and current funding. So our work is the bulk of our work, which also is more, I think is more relevant to your interests, is the work we do with refugees and the work we do with the technology. The work we do with refugees started with my arrival at Wayne State University in 2015. It was in the midst of the Syria war. And I had to, and Michigan actually has a large Arab community. Dearborn is a city near Detroit, which has, I think, the largest concentrated Arab population outside of the Middle East. And I had a simple question: what's the impact of war exposure in these refugees coming to America? I looked at the literature, there was not much happening. And basically, I didn't find any data on children and a couple of studies, mostly older on Iraqis, about adult refugees. So we decided to start looking at the impact and see what's the problem. So it was a very innocent question, basically focused on what is the impact, because if policymakers want to decide how much resources are needed for these works, they need to know what's the prevalence of impact. If 2 in 1,000 refugees are impacted by PTSD, that's a different story than when 300 in 1,000 refugees might be impacted by PTSD. So at that point, I knew we had a collaboration, my department had a collaboration with this nonprofit Arab American Chaldean Council. So they had a long-term collaboration in research and clinical work. And this nonprofit basically had a contract with the state of Michigan. Any refugee that comes to the state has to do an initial health screening within the 30 days of arrival. So they were very fresh, just coming here. we put together a team of refugee doctors. So these are Iraqi doctors. I look Middle Eastern, but I'm not Arab. I'm Iranian, and I speak Farsi, so I don't speak Arabic. We put together a team of Arab doctors who were refugees themselves from Iraq. And they would go to those clinics. The doctor who just saw the refugees for the health screening would tell them about the work we are doing here and the research study. And those who were interested and wanted to consent to the study would work with our team. And I emphasize that because this team had the best cultural experience and language understanding of what's going on with these refugees. And as a result, we were able to succeed very well in this, in the recruitment. So we basically screened for PTSD, anxiety, depression, the common consequences of trauma impact, both in adults and children. We also got interested in biomarkers. We said, how about we try to collect genetic data to join the Psychiatric Genetic Consortium, because this is a very underrepresented population in these studies. Most of these studies come from Western Europe and America, mostly white and black populations. And this was our team. And more people came in and more people came in. And the cool thing about this work was that because this is work with Middle Eastern Arab refugees, a lot of people would associate with it. Like Hiba that I showed her picture, she was a doctor in Dubai and reached out and say, I want to come and get some research experience in America. I want to work on this. Then Bassem came, who was a doctor from Egypt. Then Celine came, who is of Lebanese background. Then Raja came, of Syrian background. And then recently Rashid came, who is a Syrian doctor. So I've been extremely lucky and grateful to their work, because these are the people who understand the language and the culture of those people. Rashid, for example, has worked in Syria as a doctor with internally displaced people. And then a lot of now a lot of younger people come to us, people who are like students at Wayne State University, who are children of immigrants and refugees, and they are passionate and excited about working. So it's been very fulfilling for both of us. During the time of recruitment, we were able to, until the travel ban stopped the flow of Muslim refugees to America, we were able to collect data on not more than 90% of those who were referred to us, which I see as a good success. This is the breakdown, the Syrians and Iraqis. Looking at the adults data, as you can see, there is a fine distribution of men and women, most educated, most married. Most people came as couples. I don't know how the system works, but most of the people that we got in that wave were younger couples with children, and almost all of our children had both their parents. I think one or two children only had one parent. Everybody had all their four limbs on them, and we didn't see a lot of major serious injuries in these people. And I mentioned that it is important because these might be the people with the lower level of impact compared to a lot of other refugees who have had a lot more horrible experiences. This is an important part that I want to show. Only 5% of these people had a previous psychiatric diagnosis. And to just portray the story, actually, this is the part that I forgot to mention. For a refugee, for me, when trauma happens to someone like me, I may walk out of here and be stuck in a shooting or assaulted or raped or be in a horrible motor vehicle accident. Then I come back to my normal life, my protected life, my disability, and then I can go back to my work. But for refugees, it was constant state of instability in life during their time in Syria, because before that it was a relatively stable society as long as people were not involved in politics. But in one day they lose all of their resources. There is no reliable access to hygiene, water, food for the children, electricity, depending on who is in charge of that neighborhood. At the time, ethnically, you could be enemy or you could be friend, and constant threat to loss of the family, to loss of the children. People would be threatened with kidnapping. Family members could be kidnapped and not come back. And then those who were lucky enough to leave what they had in terms of the belongings and the family members behind, after months of enduring this stress and trauma exposure, and see views of dead bodies and all the rubbles and destructions, would end up in a camp, whether in Turkey or in Greece or in Lebanon, and they would be there in these densely populated camps with very limited access to resources for a couple of years on average before they came to America. So we are talking about a continuous ongoing few years of high stress and trauma exposure. But only 5% of these people had a previous diagnosis before they came here, which to me does not mean that they didn't have a diagnosis. It means that there was not even any psychiatric care or screening or services available to them. When it comes to prevalence, we found a very high prevalence. And it's important, I also mentioned that when we talk about PTSD, it's not much like infectious diseases that you either have the infection or don't have the infection. The way we define post-traumatic stress disorder in research is that trauma happens, and from a 0 to 100% range of all the symptoms that someone might have for trauma, we draw a line, let's say at 70%, and say, okay, whoever is above this, for us to have a common language in science, we call that PTSD. Doesn't mean that the 69 or 68 or 65% is not impacted. So now we are talking about those who have full criteria for PTSD. About 1 in 3 people, both men and women, screen positive for PTSD. About 50% screen positive for high anxiety and depression, which is a very high prevalence. This is comparable to basically lifetime prevalence in Vietnam War veterans. And interestingly, we don't here see the traditional sex difference in prevalence, because PTSD is often more common among women than men. And the theory I have about this is probably there's a ceiling effect where the trauma is so serious that everybody, regardless of their sex, that is vulnerable, may sustain the impact. As traditionally we see in the clinical work, we also saw a very high level of comorbidity between depression, PTSD, and anxiety and PTSD, and all the three, which signifies basically the level and intensity of the disability, especially for someone who just came to a new environment and they need a lot of assimilation and they need a lot of basically navigating and problem solving and going out and learning about the system. And if there is so much dragged by the depression and high intensity anxiety and PTSD avoidance symptoms, that becomes a challenge. In children, interestingly, although PTSD prevalence was higher than American children, it was not that high. What was significantly high was anxiety. We had very high level of anxiety in these children. We have different theories. One theory is that probably parents might have buffered some of the impact on children. And it is also possible that developmentally children might respond to trauma exposure more with a raw anxiety than basically well-formed symptoms of PTSD. Interestingly, separation anxiety was very high. And this is something we also hear from schools. We work with schools a lot. And through the teachers' experiences, we learn basically that separation anxiety is to the point a lot of these kids don't want to go to school. They have all the somatic symptoms we used to have when we were kids and we didn't want to go to school. And I see this as a separation anxiety more so and an adaptive response, because if I'm a child with less developed cognitive appraisal system of knowing what's happening out there, and I'm in an extremely unsafe environment, it makes sense for me to stick with my parents and not want to leave my parents. And that basically explains the suppression anxiety that they bring with themselves. And we have seen the reports of the same with Ukrainian children. A lot of them have this challenge, a difficulty of leaving their parents. A lot of them wouldn't even want to leave the subway, the bunkers where they were hiding when the bombings were happening and after the bombing would stop. We also found very high correlation between symptoms of mothers and those of children, meaning that mothers' anxiety, mothers' depression, mothers' PTSD symptoms would basically correlate highly with the symptoms of anxiety in their children. I'm going to skip some of the slides because I have a lot to talk about. I apologize for that. We also had two simple questions. One question was, overall, what's your general health status? From poor to excellent, how do you assess your health? Which basically was a very subjective assessment. An overall majority of these people, as I mentioned, are younger, healthy, physically healthy adults. And the other question was, from 1 to 7, 7 being the worst thing that you would experience, how would you rate your experience with the whole experience? So we have these questionnaires that ask so many different questions about PTSD. To learn about it, what we now through just these two subjective questions, and what we found was that there was a good correlation between PTSD symptom severity, depression, anxiety, and perceived health and perceived adversity. To the point that those who had the worst perception of the experience and worse health, about 82% of them also screened positive for PTSD, while the average rate of PTSD in the general population was 30%. So this whole work started with basically volunteer work, and all these people who were involved were volunteers, and we got some funding from some foundations. But then when we had this pilot data, we went to the NICHD and I said, can you give us some money to look at the longitudinal course and changes of the symptoms in these kids? And also add another cohort of immigrant Arab people here in Michigan. Because as an immigrant, if there are immigrants among you, you know it's tough. You have to come to a new environment and learn a lot of things from scratch, and there are a lot of stresses. But then for a refugee, what percent of the stress is the stress of migration and what percent is the war exposure? So we started recruiting a group of migrants to also be able to parse out these two different impacts, and also look over time and see what are the variables that can determine and define symptoms courses over time. So what we found, so we go to these people's houses 2 years later. 2 years later, we go to their houses and collect the same data. And again, 1.5 years after that. So we have 3 data points. We are finishing the third time point. Between the first and the second time point, it is not too much surprising to us in academia, but a lot of people would argue probably that, oh, these guys have left their country and they have left the environment of war, and now they're in safe America. They should be good. We shouldn't have any issues. What we found, which is not surprising to clinicians, the symptoms not necessarily declined. Without interventions, the severity of symptoms remained the same. And actually, some forms of trauma exposure seem to do worse for people. For example, victimization trauma. I have a graduate student, she has an interest in type of trauma, because historically, when we wanted to look at the impact of trauma on people, we would look at cumulative trauma. How many traumatic experiences did this person have over their lifetime? But now we are looking at what does the type, does what happened matter? If I was assaulted or raped, would it be different than a severe motor vehicle accident? Would it be different if I was shot at or I was tortured compared to being a natural disaster? And what we are finding is that those kinds of victimization trauma exposures, which are the traumas that are sustained through physical violence, in direct physical violence or sexual violence, can even worsen the symptoms of PTSD over time. So they might even have a different neurobiology leading to exacerbation of the symptoms. And one of the aspects we're interested in looking at now is the possibilities of differences in neurobiology, specifically when it comes to brain circuitry involved in trauma impact. Same with the children. The anxiety level on average didn't decline. PTSD symptoms didn't decline over time. We also were looking at the, as I mentioned earlier, parent symptoms correlation with those of children. What we found, interestingly, was when they come to America, symptoms of mothers and symptoms of children correlate, but symptoms of fathers don't correlate with children, which was interesting and surprising to us. And this is one of the unique aspects of this cohort, is that we have both parents for all of children, because most of the similar studies in America just have the mother. So 2 years later, when we go in and look, we see that, oh, father symptoms now correlate. For which our interpretation is that during the transitional time, father had to have a separate and different role than they usually have within the family. And father had to be the gatekeeper, be outside dealing with what is going on out there. And now that they have been here for about a couple of years, now they can come back to their role as a member of the family. And that's why we see everybody's symptoms now correlate. But sorry, interestingly, we also found mom's symptoms upon arrival affect the changes in the symptoms of the children. The better the symptoms of the mother, the better the course of the symptoms changes for the children. Same for the parents, same for the fathers. We also decided to look at the environmental stress. We gave this questionnaire, living difficulty questionnaire, to parents, asking them to tell us how they feel supported about the housing, health services, finances, social support, government support. It's very subjective. But we then looked at the parents' response and symptoms in the children. What we found is that the better the parents, the lower the parents' environmental stress when they came to America, the better fared their children over time. So some more indication that whatever is happening in the environment will impact the children's symptoms. I'm sorry, I'm just moving very fast through all. I mean, each of these data would need 15 minutes to explain. So this is the word cloud that basically shows the main stressors. So we have these interviews that we ask the people to talk about their traumatic experiences. And in parallel to that, we are collecting skin conductance data, basically a measure of autonomic activity. And they have a war zone narrative, which is basically in Syria what was painful to them, and there's a resettlement narrative talking about what was stressing to them. And during that time, they are talking to us about the most painful experiences. I'm not going to present the skin conductance data here, but these are the word clouds of the things that are bothering them post-migration. A lot of school issues, a lot of bullying is happening for these children, which is a big stressor for them. These are some of narratives from those children we heard, which is in an upcoming paper about it. And that has led actually to us being invited to start working with the state of Michigan. We have this newcomers program where they have hired some people who are trained by us, and then they go to schools, and they're basically the connection between us and schools across the state who have a lot of refugee children. So they work with the schools to educate them to how to work with the refugee children with their specific needs and the specific challenges. So at that time, a couple of, when we were collecting the data, excellent for science, but we weren't doing anything for them. And we had the challenges in the cultural connection, language barriers, cultural acceptance of our traditional treatments. I got lucky that at that time, Holly, who is an art therapist at Wayne State, came to me and said, "Oh, we heard about your work, and we do art therapy with kids. Do you want to do that?" At that same time, Lana, whose photo is here next to me, came to me as a graduate student for neuroscience, but she's also a dancer and was interested in dance therapy. Said, "How about we do it?" So we put together a team, again, volunteers. I even brought my own yoga teacher from Ann Arbor, and we worked with some nonprofit that would basically offer free transportation. We would bring a mom and a child and do art and dance and movement therapies, and we measured the impact. And we tried to do some exercise for dads also, but on the weekends, dads most of them were working, so they couldn't come. One of the most amazing findings we had here, especially those who are informed about the traditional treatments for trauma, including prolonged exposure therapy, dropouts are very high in those interventions. We had very good adherence to and completion of the course of the intervention. And we had good changes in the symptoms of declining symptoms in children, both with dance therapy and art therapy. During the COVID, we expanded this through tele art therapy and dance and movement therapy through basically the infrastructure they had in the schools. We implemented it to other refugee populations. Even Afghan refugees were here at the hotel room, and our team at a hotel, and our team would go there and do these interventions for these refugee children. And I mentioned this project where we are basically educating schools. And I think, again, one of our significant reasons for success is we have been lucky with people. For example, Victor Bolakov's photos here is a Ukrainian social worker who is involved in trauma in youth. And he's training people in Ukraine. So who's better than this guy to join our team working, talking about how to work with Ukrainian refugee children here with this cultural understanding. So shifting gears, I'm sorry, shifting gear. Another project we have here is what we call Frontline Strong Together. State of Michigan came to us and said, there's so much trauma and stress going on in the life of first responders, firefighters, EMTs, police officers, dispatchers, very stressful lifestyle. We were talking yesterday about it. A lot of overlaps with the life of a refugee. Another civilian population, especially in America, exposed to war-style stuff and shootings and gun violence and constant stressful life. Work schedule is difficult, and they see the worst of the things, especially in Detroit, the worst of the things that people do to each other and do to themselves. We started this program to basically serve these different groups of people across the state, offering services from training, education, peer support programs, prevention, treatment. And I'm a psychiatrist for Detroit Police and Fire Department and all these different groups. And as part of this, we got involved in basically developing some technology for treatment of PTSD, specifically social occupational dysfunction. So several years ago, I learned about this technology, augmented reality, and I have the headsets here and I can show it to you. So we all are familiar with virtual reality, but this is augmented reality. As you can see, my eyes are visible, which means I can see you. I can see my hands. So it's not like VR that I'm in a different world. I'm still here. So you can combine the real and the unreal. And I thought it could have immense possibilities for basically utilization and treatment. And that's where the story started. I don't have to talk about these prevalences. Exposure therapy is a very good treatment for fear-based conditions like phobia, social anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's the gold standard. If someone is afraid of dogs, we don't sit here and talk about why dogs are safe. We do exposure therapy. And this is actually how I overcame my own fear of heights. The challenge is that if somebody comes to my clinic and says, I'm afraid of dogs, I don't have a dog in my clinic. And even if I go get my dog from home and bring it here, my dog doesn't listen well. A lot of patients don't want to do that because they know there is the real object of their terror here. They avoid the treatment. Even if we do it all and they are okay with my Great Pyrenees, they go see the pit bull in their life environment and they get scared. So that's why exposure therapy is very rarely implemented. And when it comes to trauma and PTSD, mostly exposure is to trauma memories rather than the situations people are avoiding because of trauma. And that's why a lot of our traditional treatments for PTSD, they reduce the nightmares and flashbacks, but disability remains. And I have a lot of police officers and firefighters who don't want to go back to work, or they don't want to go to a grocery store. So what we do hey, what's up therapy, as I call it in the clinic. We go to the therapist and say, how are you? And we talk about daily life, and then they go back. So this is the image I usually use for augmented reality because that's the best distinction in the mind of public compared to virtual reality. So there have been works in the past use of virtual reality for treatment of phobias and post-traumatic stress disorder. The majority of PTSD environments, basically you wear the goggles and you're in the streets of Iraq or Afghanistan. It's for veterans with PTSD, and exposure is to the trauma environment. But my focus here for PTSD was exposure to what in the normal life people are avoiding because of their trauma. So I just mentioned these before. We can do Q generalization. You can have as many objects as possible. You can have visual access to the therapist, which is very good with augmented reality. In VR, you're in a different world. In AR, your therapist is standing in front of you and you can see them. And it has the possibility for telemedicine because you will see what is around you and you will not trip over your coffee table and land on your face. So we started this technology with very simple. We found some funds and Wayne State University got a patent, and we found some programmer company that developed this software for us. This is what we had. So I see a 3D map of the patient's environment. The yellow light is where the patient is looking at. This ring here, if you can see, is where they are standing. And I can choose any spider of any type, size, color, shape. This is actually a video BBC took. They came here, they brought their own patient and said, hey, how about you treat this patient and we're going to film it. And we stole some of the video. And as you can see, it's very surface mapping well, and when you wear the goggles, it's 3D. So it feels very realistic, and our patients really get terrified. So I will show some data how the level of fear was in response. We even put a spider web on the wall. They walk through the spider web. That's the last stage. And at some point, I leave the room to basically allow them to be alone with like 50 crab-sized spiders crawling all over the place to basically gain a sense of autonomy dealing with. And this is 40 some minutes after the treatment. So this was a person who was 12 meters away from the tarantula before the treatment. And this is after treatment. So, and what we found was that actually I can get to the results here. I don't have to.
More than anything, we also see that at some point you need to be holding on to a tarantula. Were those your hands holding the tarantula?
I love that tarantula. His name is Tony STARC with a C.
Got it.
Yeah, he's very cute. And he's right now on sabbatical at Eastern Michigan University because they're running a clinical trial. And this is what I wanted to show. The skin conductance responses to a real tarantula and during the treatment, not different. Basically shows the same fear response is created. I'm going to fly through a lot of these slides. 38 minutes average response time, just one session. That's it. A month later, they come back, the effects are still there. BATs, the distance from the spider. Mean distance was 6.5 meters, and then boom, gone. This was one of the text messages we got 6 months later from one of our participants. So then the pandemic happened. And we first said, how about we use our time that we can't do anything else and create an app. I said, I do a lot of public education work. So we created this app, Pandemic Stress Tips. You can download it free on your phone. And an avatar of me will be talking about how to deal with the pandemic stress. Not because I'm very arrogant, but because we wanted to see if we can create someone's therapist for them. And that was some basically practice. But at the same time, I had this graduate student, undergrad student, very bright, very good into coding. He was funded to do some fMRI research. We couldn't scan. I said, Shantanu, how about you just try to play around with this code and see if you can learn it? He rewrote the whole software. And basically, we turn it to something that could be from laboratory that can be used in real clinical practice. And then we added dogs and we added spiders. So now we have different breeds of dogs for fear of dogs. And these dogs can sit, can bark, can jump, can walk from here to there. And we have snakes. So we are running currently a clinical trial for fear of dogs. The same impact, the same amount of fear, and the same results. People are able to come and hug my Great Pyrenees and walk the dog. And it has been going well. So Then we decided, okay, it's about time to go to the phobias are cool, but let's go to the realm of human interactions. And for that, we decided to basically create real life situations that people are avoiding because of their trauma. In light of this project we had with first responders, I have a lot of cops and firefighters, they don't want to go back to work. Example that I will share later is that because the brain is in constant threat detection mode, they avoid anything that resembles trauma, anything that, especially for those whose source of trauma is human related, they avoid humans, they avoid gatherings. So we did a lot of we made a lot of mistakes because we were trailblazing. We didn't know, nobody else was doing this thing. So we just started working on basically creating this, working with some amateur people who program this for us. Very simple proof of concept technology.
How was your vacation last week?
It was really good. It rained a few times, but we went to museums and shopping those days, which was great. The trip was too short, though.
They always are.
That bill is gonna be a doozy.
Yikes, I hope it's not too bad. What's going on with your car? I hope it's nothing too serious.
That's not what I said.
Comes
Tuesdays
over and more this, some questions, a lot of background stuff. So the idea was we can gradually step by, and we made it as easy as possible. Just click next, so more people come. Next, more people come. And then the noises come in, and we started testing this in people. This is a case, she was a police officer who was sexually assaulted at work, and she was doing grocery shopping online. The level of avoidance was to that degree. She was on medication, she was doing traditional therapies, not very helpful with what's happening outside. She started doing treatments, and this really does trigger people again, the same way the phobias do. So she was standing in a corner with her hands like this, watching all these characters, the back to the wall, hands sweaty, skin conductance responses through the roof. And that night, she sent this email. It's just one case, though. That's a caveat. It's just one case. A lot of excitement and motivation and energy that we put into this. And she did a few more sessions. She actually appeared on the BBC report, and she was able to go to sit in her own graduation ceremony. So we got more serious. Then we started working with this company that is, and I'm aware of time, I'll try my best to finish soon. We started working with this company that has worked, this is Luke Ritchie, our new partner, has worked with Disney and Marvel and White House, and they have very good experience. Still, we had to do a lot of trailblazing. We started expanding this to not only situations of like a gathering or a grocery store, but also make it more customizable, meaning that I can fit this group of people in any room size. I mean, as long as it's not a closet. And it can happen through telemedicine. So it's a Wi-Fi to Wi-Fi connection. That was a ton of work for us. Now I can be here. You could be wearing these goggles in your living room if it's not too much clutter, and we can go through the different stages of the treatment. We have a police station roll call room. We have a fire station, and we have a grocery store. And as you can see here, this is the control panel. I see what the patient sees. I have a bird's eye view. I can also add a lot of sounds in the background. Any sound that can trigger people, gunshot, people crying, people screaming, and go back and forth and increase and decrease the intensity, and also enter the level of anxiety. 0 to 10, how anxious are you for the research purpose?
Discipline to pursue this work here with our station.
Walk over here and distract me, but not any more than you. You have a great response.
And it has a stereo sound.
The truck was engulfed in flames. I had to pull the driver out. He was covered in blood and unconscious. Not in my mind.
Yeah, the guy.
Copy, shots fired at 78 Spring Street. Car 2, radio check, checking your status. Repeat, Car 2, checking your status.
It was a lot, yeah.
So now a critical incident happens, they have to leave the room. And if you get closer to one group, you will hear them better than the other group.
Can you confirm your location?
So you have the same thing basically for the firefighters, same people, just we change the outfit and some of the conversation.
Good to know.
You can have a grocery store, and then again, people of diverse backgrounds walk in, and some of them come to you, ask you a question. And then the other thing we did was we created a library of 60-some characters that you can pick from and put in front of your patient and command their behavior. So this is a conversation happening live between myself and these characters directed by my colleague.
I am Officer Collins here with Officer Smith. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for asking.
Are you guys coming off your shift?
Yes, it was a tough one.
I'm sorry to hear that it was tough. What did happen?
We had to do CPR on a 10-year-old child. It didn't go well.
And then I can choose all of this person's behavior. I can say, okay, tap your hand, your foot, shrug your shoulders, smile, frown, look surprised. So now this goes beyond the traditional, okay, we want to do exposure therapy for PTSD, because now you as a therapist have a tool that you can use for simulating any human interactive situation you want to. This can apply to people with social anxiety disorder, people with autism spectrum disorder, severe mental illness, practicing job interview, practicing dating. All these different utilities can happen. And at the next stage, starting in winter, we are going to plug in AI, which means there are companies that help you write a human brain. InWorld is one of those companies. You write basically the story of someone. You define their personality, we define their voice, define their style, introverted, extroverted, their hobbies, interests, lack of interest, and then create basically a conversation with them. And you can have a conversation with that live character. So now we will plug in this technology into the AI, to AR, which is augmented reality. And then not only we will have a live conversation with character, but also the behavior and the nonverbal aspects of the character is run by the AI. For example, with first responders, we can use this for basically training them how to deal with like do a de-escalation situation, dealing with a severely mentally ill patient, or you just the situations would be limitless, as a therapist can write the brain and just plug it in, and the patient will have an interaction with them. I think that is it. And this is Mishka, who was involved in basically treatment of fear of dogs.